Uh, I think by now it's known that I have no sympathy with the unique identification project. The reasons are actually multifold, and I won't try telling you all of them now. But I think the first thing that I'd say is that the UID project is sold to us as a very simple thing, which is just providing everybody with an identity. And if it actually were just that, it may not be such a problem. In fact, it would be welcome. It would have been fine. But actually, it's a question of convergence, tracking, profiling, placing under surveillance. It's got to do with the state wanting to know what every person is doing. And I don't think it's innocent that in a country like India, where in 2005 you had the Right to Information Act coming in, you now have, soon after that, a unique identification number project coming in. Because in the RTI, which is the Right to Information, you have the state having to be transparent, the government and the state having to be transparent to every citizen. And plainly, that kind of changes the nature of power equation between the citizen and the state. And you can see the state using technology and corporate interest, the collusion of corporate interest with governmental interest, trying to reverse it again and make every individual transparent to the state so that the control reverts again to those who are already in power.
With the desirability of the unique ID database. For the simple reason that I think it's an overkill, it's a top-down approach, it is not sensitive to the way in which the politics and political institutions and mobilities of people, etc. and so on and so forth, all of which should actually justify the UID, have been thought through carefully. So I think that there is going to be a whole lot of confusion, and at best it will become another document, at worst it can become a nightmare for people.
See, on the question of voluntariness, it's very interesting. I think voluntariness as a notion within the UID was just a marketing strategy. I don't think there was any intention for it to be voluntary, because if if people have multiple identities already and you don't require this additional one, you're not going to take it. If you think that this can actually devalue your identity, then you're not going to take it. So you would actually be judging it. Every person would be judging whether they wanted to take this identity or not. And the UIDAI is looking, and Mr. Nilekani, who's its head, throughout his agenda has been to get everyone onto the database. The UID is about creating a citizen database, a resident database. It's about knowing everything about everyone. So the idea of voluntariness simply doesn't sit with the three things that Mr. Nilekani in 2009 November, I heard him say. It should be unique, it should be universal, and it should be ubiquitous. Now, universal and ubiquitous are completely contrary to the idea of voluntariness. So I think it's pretty plain that it was never intended to be voluntary. In addition, after the project started off, Mr. Nilekani has himself been the author of reports where essentially they are finding ways of making people have to take a UID, whether it is on the public distribution system or on the LPG gas connections. So these are agendas that are carried forward by Mr. Nilekani. This is not a voluntary agenda. This is an agenda of mandatoriness. So I don't think it was ever intended to be that. As for the relationship between the UID and the National Population Register, if you read it, you find that essentially the National Population Register was meant to use the UID as its back office. The UID was not meant to do enrollment on its own. But Mr. Nilekani was a man in a hurry. And since he has shown through many of his reports his contempt for the government and for governmental functioning, and since he's also shown his valorization of corporate efficiency and corporate functioning, he decided to take that over. And since we have a corporatized, Prime Minister, Prime Ministerial and Planning Commission Deputy Chair in place, that it's not just a collusion of interest, it's also a meeting of heart and soul. So it produced something that, so the if I were just to say one thing about this, it's that the National Population Register is a governmental project. The UID we don't even know what project it is. All we know is that the executive notification by which they were set up allows them to own the data. That's something that even a government doesn't claim to do, that it doesn't own the data. It holds data, it uses data, it manages data, it delivers on the basis of data, but there's no question of ownership. Whereas here, for the first time, with the corporate coming into the government, you find the idea of ownership of my data and your data being merely handed over through an executive notification. So these are really different paradigms.
Don't really think that the UID registration is at this point of time being left to the voluntary choice of the people. Although technically it is supposed to be voluntary, it's actually being pushed through a variety of institutions that enter into contractual arrangements with people. So while statutorily it is not compulsory, through contractual relationships it is being mandatory because people do need services from people and so on and so forth. The NPR, I think, is a very different kind of ball game. It has at least some kind of a constitutional mandate. The nation state has to produce certain sorts of databases and so on. And it is something with which we can engage, we can argue, we can debate. But the framework for the UID itself is not something that's very clear, that, and nor is it rooted in any structure in such a way that we can engage with this lineage.
See, there's two sides, there are two parts of this to this question. The first is the question about the BPL itself. The problem that many people who work on the field have identified is that there is under-inclusion of people who ought to be recognized as being BPL. And the idea of fraudulent entries is something that is spoken about a lot, and we know, of course, it exists. It exists in every database anywhere in the world, perhaps, but certainly here, where the numbers are so huge. But also, I think a lot of these, from researches that my friends have done, have to do with ineligibility rather than with fraudulence. That people are on databases because they have not taken themselves off databases. At one time, the ration card used to be our primary identity. We used to walk around with it as the one way by which you could get, by which you could get a house on rent, by any transaction you wanted, by which we would get ourselves bank accounts. The ration card was one such. So it was a document you retained whether you used it for collecting rations or not. Even after we became ineligible, these are things that we've retained. So if you're weeding those out now, that's got nothing to do with the BPL. What has to do with the BPL is a greater earnestness from the state to want to reach the people who need the kind of support that the state should be offering. And therefore it was a problem of under-inclusion. The UID keeps talking about fraud people being on the database and having to remove people all the time. That's their primary interest. So that's one set of problems. On the cash transfer, the UID makes it appear like the UID is a magic wand. When you get the UID, the banking system will open up and the whole country will be covered by banks, bank branches, banking correspondents, and an extreme amount of efficiency, which will deliver cash at the doorstep of every person. The fact, however, as anybody who's been in this country, who's read any report in connection with this country and who's gone to any place will find, we've had, especially from rural areas and in the urban spaces in areas where you have slums and squatter settlements, these are places where you do not have banking services reaching. Banks are not interested. Banks are doing business. They want people who have a lot of money. They are not interested in the poor. The transaction cost for them in relation to every poor person is far higher than they are willing to bear. Now they are being forced to come into the so-called financial inclusion system, and you have now people who, you've got the same kind of banking structure you had before. Now, of course, you want to open it out to corporates. So again, corporates can come and control the money of the poor. So you have no banks, no branches. You have a banking correspondence system which is being talked about, which was tried in 2006 And in 2009, the RBI, Reserve Bank of India, produced a report which said that the banking correspondence system has failed in this country. You have big bankers telling you that 80 to 95% of accounts opened through banking correspondence are dormant accounts. Nobody operates them for a range of reasons, because banking correspondence don't reach, because people don't use the banking system in that way. There are a range of reasons why, and that hasn't even been analyzed. So what it does tell us, and this is something I think various people who've been following the UID have told us, that it's not like these systems will work because you have the UID. The UID needs the excuse of these systems to get enrollment. That's it. So in that sense, the financial inclusion question is a fraud in a series of ways. One is that while they're talking financial inclusion, actually they're talking about what they are attempting to do is to dismantle the service structure. To do that, you need to be able to show that you're doing something else in its place. And cash transfer is precisely that. Once you say you're doing cash transfer, you say, it's better. And I find it most offensive that they use the poor as their launching pad, and then they use terms which they would never, like they say the poor have no use for privacy, but look, we are giving autonomy to the poor by giving them the money, and then they can use it in any way that they want. So this, speaking with the tongue which has no, which is amoral, is part of the problem of this, because the financial inclusion question is not a question of not having an identity. It is a question of not having banks being interested in the poor. It's a question of banking services not reaching where the poor are. And it's a question of the banking correspondence system having failed. So if you're just resurrecting that in the discourse and not changing anything in on the ground, it's an extraordinary kind of falsity to achieve ends which are unconnected with what you're telling the people. There's a language that's being manufactured in this process. Like they call something the micro ATM. It is micro, all right, because all it is a machine, handheld machine, on which it will tell them how much money there is in their bank, and it will, it's a question of recognizing it as a biometric reader. But you have this person who is sitting there controlling that machine, who knows how much money you have, and who will hand the money over to you. The fundamental protection that you have with an ATM, where nobody outside of that machine and you at that time knows how much money you have and what you're taking out of it. The fundamental protection that you have, that a banker can be penalized and made liable if they were to divulge information about you to anybody else and use it in any other way. All that is lost in this. It's not an ATM at all. It is not automatic. And it does not provide the privity between the person and their account. It brings in an agent, and a third person is what we are constantly saying we need to get rid of. So instead of having the person who's, for instance, the person who's done the work, getting their wages from the NREGA, the Rural Employment Guarantee field, now they have to go through getting an UID, getting a bank account, that the banker has to send a banking correspondent, that the banking correspondent has to acknowledge that this is the kind of, your biometric works, and that they will hand over the money correctly. So you're creating layer after layer of obstacle to people to realizing what is theirs. This is not a facility. This is using it for completely different purposes. The day that they actually have banks keen about working for the poor, and also remember, every one of these adds costs to the system. If you're going to have a banking correspondent, it adds a cost. If you're going to have a handheld machine that has to be carried around and then regularly replaced, there's a cost. If the bank has to monitor, monitoring costs are huge. So this is not a costless process. The money will go from somewhere. It's just that it won't go to the poor, it will be going to somebody else.
I agree with that in the sense that, in the previous question we were talking about whether or not it's voluntary, right? If it is voluntary, then it cannot be a prerequisite for anything that the state actually provides for the people. So in that sense, I think there's something very strange going on here, where on the one hand you're saying that it is voluntary, but then on the other hand you're saying that it's a prerequisite for something. So that contradiction has to be resolved somehow, and I don't quite know how the government itself can resolve that.
The question really is only partially about whether the information which is held with the on the UID AI database can be misused. The point is, what does the UID AI do? It produces this number, which it is working very hard, and this chairperson is working very hard to have seeded onto every database. It is working actively and not as a fallout or as an unintended consequence. It is working for convergence of databases. It is working for profiling of people. It is working openly saying that it will help track people. It's helping surveillance techniques. It is a process by which if you are not on it, you don't exist. It's determinative of identities. So when we are talking about abuse of this data, it's not just about the data that they collect, because it will seem like, oh, it's just, I just have this number, I just have your name, your address, very basic data and some biometrics. How can any of this be misused? So at one level, it is true that there is misuse that's possible there, but I'll come to that in a bit. But the point is that the production of that UID number and pushing for it to be on every database is one way that they are making sure that there will be various kinds of uses, and I use uses within inverted commas. So you can call them abuses, you can call them misuses, you can just call them uses. But the potential for each of these things that I mentioned a while ago are so huge, and you can already see that that's the intention. They're actually talking about each of these. They're talking about tracking migrants, tracking children, tracking dropouts. They're talking about knowing who these people are through the various databases being converged. And without convergence of databases, they say, how are we going to weed out anything? So we need to do it. Essentially, every individual in this country, because technology now, according to them, permits it. I still believe it hasn't reached that stage. But that, because it may permit it, we should now be able to tell each individual who they are, what they were through their life. Because remember that the ambition of this project is not temporal, it's intertemporal. It kind of goes across temporality. So, that's the kind of ambition, that's the kind of monstrous vision that this project has. And it's difficult for me to, forget that that's the eyes through which this project is being viewed. On the data itself, when they started, they said they would be taking only minimal data. But take just even within that, take what they've done. They've got man, woman, transgender. It's all very nice to be politically correct and put in whatever you want, but did they at all discuss what it would mean, who can use it, who can access it, what kind of abuses transgendered are subjected to in this country? We haven't even looked at the sociological consequences of it. It's treated as if just acknowledging that a person is you're not acknowledging it with that person. This is a governance structure, this is a top-down thing. So if today it's alright to be transgender, tomorrow it might not, and then you don't know where you are with it. The other kind of thing is that, when they started, they did not ask for things like bank account numbers, they didn't ask for mobile phones, email addresses. Now it's like a marketing transaction, place. And they have a clause there which says that, do you give your consent for us to hand this data over to anybody? It's like an information giving consent. And it's a blanket consent. And we've noticed that, of course, the default mode is yes. To any person who provides you with any service. So even the boot black provides a service. So, and that includes, and they are clear, that includes biometric data. So the idea of, and let's also remember that Mr. Nilekani is also the author of another report called the Tag Up Report, Technology Advisory Group on Unique Projects, where he says that, that report says that they're going to set up these national information utilities, which will collect all the data that the government has, make private companies which will hold this data, which will, according to them, act in the public interest, for profit making, not profit maximizing. So they are talking about data as the new property. And this is the data about a population that is being collected and handed over. They want it to be handed over to private companies. Even the UID database is now owned by the UID AI, which, like I said, we don't know who they are, and it's owned by them. So the idea of data as property and of population data as property is a very strong component of this whole project. So when you ask about can it be abused, misused, whatever, the point is that once you have it in your hands, you're a good guy, you may not misuse it. You may be a good guy, but then some friend of yours may want it, you might want to help them with it. There are, it's like you're opening up something that people don't have any business opening.
think the first thing to actually think through is what is the proper use for unique identification database. That proper use of the database itself has not been really very well defined. And under such circumstances, it's actually very difficult to say what is misuse. There are risks which are quite well known, which is that at this point of time, there is so much data that's available, and it's actually possible for anyone, if one is intent enough on that and one has the statistical skills and some insight into how societies function, to de-anonymize information in any database. I think the UID is basically going to make it a little easier. So.
It's I think what you need to really, I mean, what I would, the way I see this is, does the public really serve the UID's interest? Because the UID AI is right now, it's like a vulture which is looking for every place that it can prey on to get the data that it wants. And Mr. Nilekani has said from the beginning, I am only producing an identity, this is open architecture, anybody can use it any way they want. So, I mean, these are not my words, this is not even the mood and the temper in which I am saying it. This is, reflecting what I've heard over the years and which other people have also heard over the years. So, open architecture of data about individuals, about production of what he calls an identity, these don't sound very much to me like public service. These sound very much like irresponsibility. And I think one of the very important things, people talk to you all the time about information asymmetry. And in this case, you find that the asymmetry in information is where the public is not informed about what this project is, what it means. I mean, we've been saying it from the beginning. There isn't even a feasibility study on this. There's nothing at all. It's just, it's a coterie of people who are sitting there and deciding the Indian population can be treated like this. So if it's a question of who the public is in that sense. So in that sense, the public doesn't know what this is supposed to do for them. What they did know was when they were told it's voluntary, you go and take it if you want. Many people didn't, because they have enough to identify themselves. They didn't need the UID to come and give. Therefore, the bullying, the intrusiveness, the oppression that this brings. You see some of the videos that have been taken, the camera work that's been done by various agencies. There's one which we saw recently on Bombay, where at 3 o'clock in the morning the reporter goes there to see what, to see what's happening there. And these are people who are you have a child saying, no, I have to be here from 3 in the morning because I have to get my UID number. Because if I don't get it, they're telling me I can't write my 10th standard exam. You have people in Delhi who said that, no, the government says that we can't admit, schools can't admit people in the economically weaker section category unless they have a UID number. This is not serving the public. This is providing barriers and obstacles because you want enrollment. So the idea of UID as public service, where they are actually looking to become independent of all other agencies, of producing something that will pin identities on people but not allow people to use their own identity, in various ways. That's the kind of oppression the system is bringing in, and it's plain now. If you want gas connection, if you want to go by train, if you want to enter a school, if you want to write an exam. I heard recently if you want to be in a youth festival, anything you want to do, if you don't have it. So this is a bullying state, and that's what the UID is not just facilitating, it's actually pushing for a bullying state so that they can be sufficient enrollment. Even as a project, it's undemocratic, but the way in which it is being done now, the undemocratic nature has just, it's expanded beyond any proportions of decency.
This question actually goes back to the first one, which is whether or not the UID database is a desirable database at all. I do think that the Indian economy, the Indian nation states role in the global economy has reached a point where the conventional identification systems are not quite working anymore. We do need something better than that. The question is, how do we leap from the recognition of some kind of a new need to a design that has not emerged from struggles, that has not emerged through people fighting over what is the best way to do it. What we have in the UID, I think, is a system that comes from people who have not actually been steeped in how governments function, how governments collect data, so on and so forth, which is why the tremendous optimism at the beginning that this will lead to lesser corruption, the optimism about how this is actually going to result in unique identities being given to each person, how a perfect system is going to emerge. All of that optimism comes from the fact that people know clue about how governments at the ground level actually gather up data about people and places. So given all of that, I think there are huge problems with, with the way the scheme will work, because it's just not rooted in the ethos of government functioning at this point in time.